Good morning. Welcome to Sunday live stream worship with First Unitarian Church of Hobart, Indiana. My name is Pete O'Day, and I'm a member of our worship committee, and I will be facilitating our service this morning. It is great to be with you all again. We here at First Unitarian of Hobart are Unitarian Universalists, a religious faith comprised of people with diverse beliefs and shared values. Our diverse beliefs are expressed in our 6 sources, and our shared values are expressed in our 7 principles, both of which can be easily found online. Together, we strive to grow spiritually, build community, and live our values in the world. During this time of responsible social distancing, we are striving to maintain the authenticity of our services. So we want to draw your attention to several parts of our service today and to recognize the individuals who helped create them. The bell you heard ringing a moment ago was our actual church bell, which was recorded by Bob Allen. The chalice, which you will see being lit today, is our actual chalice in front of a green screen of our chapel, which has been made possible by James Johnson. The music you hear is recorded each week by our music director, Jeremy Jacobson. And the technical aspects of this service and a great deal of work is done by our own John Halstead almost every week. We appreciate that. If you are willing and able, we invite you to leave your cameras on during the service so that your fellow congregants can see you just as they would if you were physically present in our sanctuary. There will be a time in the service where you will all be unmuted briefly to say good morning to one another. We are currently streaming on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. Our service is recorded and will be made available for future viewing on Facebook, YouTube, and our church's website. Our congregation is currently in search for a full-time minister. When we do not have a minister in the pulpit, we invite members or guests to share a special message with us. This is one such Sunday. We are fortunate today to receive a homily, a teaching service prepared for us by Cindy Hesemann, a member of our Faith in Action Committee, and an active member of our congregation for many years. Cindy has been a professional teacher and advocate for opportunity her entire adult life. First as a teacher of the deaf in Illinois, later as a vocational counselor for the deaf and the blind in Indiana, and presently as a high school teacher in Chesterton, Indiana, specializing in accommodations for those students with learning disabilities. Cindy's service today will include poems and readings read by fellow congregants Sadal Govas, Ruth Halstead, Myra Seski, and Stephanie Dow. Now, please take a deep breath and join us in a spirit of reverence as we listen to our prelude performed by Jeremy Jacobson. Thank you, Jeremy. Please join me now in speaking together our chalice lighting words displayed on your screen. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together.
Lucille Clifton was an American poet, writer, and educator from Buffalo, New York. From 1979 to 1985, she was a poet laureate of Maryland. Clifton was a finalist twice for the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Her poem is called "Won't You Celebrate With Me?" Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come, celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed.
That was absolutely powerful and moving, Sada. One of the things that I love about poetry is how it can resonate with us in a very deep place and how we can draw meaning from it as it relates to our lives. Our opening hymn will be Lift Every Voice and Sing. But before we begin, I'd like to say a few words. Many people would be surprised to learn that Lift Every Voice and Sing was first written as a poem. Created by James Weldon Johnson, an NAACP lawyer, it was performed for the first time by 500 school children in celebration of President Lincoln's birthday on February the 12th, 1900, in Jacksonville, Florida. The poem was set to music by Johnson's brother, John Rosamond Johnson, and was soon adopted by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, as its official song. Today, Lift Every Voice and Sing is one of the most cherished songs of the African American Civil Rights Movement and is often referred to as the Black National Anthem. Please join me in singing Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present adventures. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Stormy the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when Hobart born had died, yet with our a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of a bright star is cast. God of our wearies, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadow beneath thy hand, we may forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
Please join me in speaking together our affirmation of faith as displayed on your screen. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament. Service is its prayer. And this is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. You will now be offered an opportunity to unmute yourself and offer greetings to each other as the Spirit moves you.
Good morning, everybody. From the
Good
Morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
morning.
Good to see
Morning,
everybody.
everyone.
Good morning.
Hear me now?
Good morning.
No.
We hear you.
Morning.
Morning.
Everybody.
Morning, Maggie.
Good morning. So good to see
From all that dwell below the skies, let signs of hope and faith arise. Then peace, goodwill, on earth be sown. Through every land and region. Amen.
Unable to gather in person, this congregation expresses our greatest joys and deepest sorrows in new ways. We pause, listening to what arises from within our hearts. And when so moved, we share these concerns, not verbally, but via the chat box. Please type in a chat box any joys, concerns, or milestones you have which you wish to share. Your joys and concerns are not made public beyond this immediate space and are not part of the recorded service posted on Facebook, YouTube, or our website.
Our story of all ages is Amazing Grace by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Carolyn Birch. Grace was a girl who loved stories. She didn't mind if they were read to her or told to her or made up in her own head. She didn't care if they were from books or movies or out of Nana's long memory. Grace just loved stories. And after she had heard them, and sometimes while they were still going on, Grace would act them out, and she always gave herself the most exciting part. Grace went into battle as Joan of Arc and wove a wicked web as Anansi the spider. She hid inside the wooden horse at the gates of Troy. She went exploring for lost kingdoms. She sailed the 7 seas with a peg leg and a parrot. She was Aladdin, rubbing his magic lamp to make the genie appear, and Mowgli in the backyard jungle. Most of all, Grace loved to act out adventure stories and fairy tales. When there was no one else around, Grace played all the parts herself. She set out to seek her fortune with no companion but her trusty cat, and found a city with streets paved in gold. Sometimes she would get Ma and Nana to join in when they weren't too busy. Then she was Dr. Grace, and their lives were in her hands. One day, Grace's teacher said they would do the play Peter Pan. Grace knew what she wanted to be. When she raised her hand, Ross says, "You can't be Peter. That's a boy's name." But Grace kept her hand up. "You can't be Peter Pan," whispered Natalie. "He isn't black." But Grace kept her hand up. "All right," said the teacher. "Lots of you want to be Peter Pan, so we'll have to have auditions next week to choose parts." She gave them the words to learn. When Grace got home, she seemed sad. "What's the matter?" asked Ma. "Roz says I couldn't be Peter Pan because I'm a girl." "That just shows what Roz knows," said Mom. "A girl can be Peter Pan if she wants to." Grace cheered up. Then later she remembered something else. "Natalie said I can't be Peter Pan because I'm black," she said. Ma looked angry, but before she could speak, Nana said, "It seems Natalie is another one who don't know nothing. You can be anything you want, Grace, if you put your mind to it." On Saturday, Nana told Grace they were going out. In the afternoon, they caught a bus and train into town. Nana took Grace to the Grand Theater. The sign outside read, "Rosalie Wilkins in Romeo and Juliet," in sparkling lights. "Are we going to the ballet, Nana?" asked Grace. "We are, honey. But first, I want you to look at this picture." Grace looked up and saw a beautiful young ballerina in a tutu. Above the dancer, it said, "Stunning New Juliet." "That one is little Rosalie from back home in Trinidad," said Nana. "Her granny and me, we grew up together on the island. She's always asking me do I want tickets to see her Rosalie dance. So this time I said yes." After the ballet, Grace played the part of Juliet, dancing around her room in her imaginary tutu. "I can be anything I want," she thought. On Monday, the class met for auditions to choose who would be best for each part. When it was Grace's turn to be Peter, she knew exactly what to do and all the words to say. She had been Peter Pan all weekend. She took a deep breath and imagined herself flying. When it was time to vote, the class chose Raj to be Captain Hook and Natalie to be Wendy. There was no doubt who would be Peter Pan. Everybody voted for Grace. "You were fantastic," whispered Natalie. The play was a big success, and Grace was an amazing Peter Pan. After it was all over, she said, I feel as if I could fly all the way home. You probably could, said Ma. Yes, said Nana. If Grace put her mind to it, she can do anything she wants. Thank you. The end.
Thank you, Ruth. You always delight me with your ability to add life to the stories that you tell. As a teacher, I love Amazing Grace because it's a tale about the importance of dreaming big and having representation. And it's not a new story. It's over 25 years old now, but it's as it resonates now as it did then. And it makes a lovely Christmas gift if you're so in need. Good morning, my friends. I remember sitting on an old wooden pew and bathed in golden light in our little Unitarian church when I first learned that Susan B. Anthony, noted suffragist and feminist icon, had been a Unitarian. I remember our minister, Roger Bruin, telling a humorous story about how Miss Anthony, known as the woman with the alligator purse, had a tendency to clobber the men around her with said purse who dared disagree with her in her righteous defense of the rights of women. Roger Bruin took obvious pride in telling us about Susan B. Anthony's Unitarian roots. She rightfully deserves a place in our pantheon of great Unitarian women of history, he said. But there is another woman I would like to speak about today, and one whose voice I would like to amplify. She was a contemporary of Susan B. Anthony's and was a collaborator with her on matters related to abolition and suffrage. She, too, was a Unitarian and, I believe, worthy of inclusion in the pantheon. But perhaps because she was Black, her name and story are not as well known. I believe it is time to rectify this and for us to meet this most remarkable writer and activist whose name was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. I first came across Frances Harper's name unexpectedly when I was looking for quotes on the UU Worship Web for our recent women's suffrage service. I found a short skit about great Unitarian women of history. I had a familiarity with some of the names: Abigail Adams, Julia Ward Howe, and Clara Barton, to name three. But one name was completely unknown to me: Frances Harper, who was described as the mother of African American journalism. I realized that I knew nothing of her story, but going further in that moment seemed like it would have been a rabbit hole of distraction. And I filed that name away and, quite honestly, would have forgotten all about it. But as fate would have it, and as the day grew closer to the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, on two separate occasions during two unrelated TV programs, I heard Harper's name mentioned. I listened as they discussed her importance to the abolition and women's suffrage movements, and I felt a combination of pride, knowing that she was a Unitarian, a little embarrassment that I did not know her personal history, and a deep shame that I had never been aware of the larger story of how white women had marginalized Black women in the quest to obtain the right to vote. Now, I don't know about you, but when something keeps coming up in my life, I have learned to pay heed to it and to follow it wherever it leads. And this is how this morning's talk was born. The more I learned about Frances Harper, the more excited I got. I wanted to share her story with you all, figuring that for some of you, it would be the first time you are learning about her too. Because I feel, as Unitarians, it is part of our role as advocates and allies to center people who have traditionally been marginalized, to reclaim stories that have been forgotten or suppressed, and to amplify voices that for too long have been silenced. With the help of some friends, I will attempt this morning to bring the spirit of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper into the space as we learn about her remarkable life. Frances Watkins was born free in 1825 in Baltimore, Maryland. Maryland at that time was a slave state. And although Frances was born to a free family, slavery surrounded her. Her parents' names have been lost to history, but we know that after her mother died when Frances was 3, she was raised by her uncle, William Watkins, a teacher at the Academy for Negro Youth and a radical political figure in civil rights. William Watkins, an AME, African Methodist Episcopal minister, was a major influence on Frances's later political, religious, and social views. Frances Watkins attended the Academy for Negro Youth, where her uncle taught, and the rigorous education she received there, along with the activist example of her uncle, affected and influenced her writings. After she left school in 1839, Watkins's first poems were published in abolitionist periodicals, such as Frederick Douglass's newspaper, The North Star. When she was 20, in 1845, Frances's first book of poems, Forest Leaves, was published. This was just 5 years after she began writing, and it made Frances one of the very first Black women to have her work appear in print in America. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was an accomplished woman long before she was married, 20 years to be exact. So many of her works were published under her maiden name of Watkins. In 1850, Watkins left Baltimore in order to teach domestic science at Union Seminary, an AME-affiliated school for Black students near Columbus, Ohio. That school would later be classified as the first historically Black college or university, HBCU, that was owned and run by African Americans. As the first woman to teach there, we are told her acceptance of the position was met with considerable protest. 2 years later, in 1852, Frances took another teaching position in Pennsylvania. During this time, she lived in an underground railroad station where she helped former enslaved peoples make their way to Canada. This experience had a profound effect on Watkins, her poetry, and her later work as an activist. In 1854, Watkins was exiled from Maryland because of new slavery laws, stating that Black people who came in through the northern border of Maryland could be sold into slavery. This marked a turning point in Watkins' public activism. She began giving anti-slavery speeches throughout New England and Canada as a representative of the main anti-slavery society. Her speeches included her prose and poetry, in which she combined the issues of racism, feminism, and classism. Myra will now read an excerpt from one of Frances Watkins' most famous poems, The Slave Mother.
He is not hers, although she bore for him a mother's pains. He is not hers, although her blood is coursing through his veins. He is not hers, for cruel hands may rudely tear apart the only wreath of household love that binds her breaking heart.
Thank you, Myra. Throughout the 2 stanzas, Watkins demonstrates the restricted relationships between an enslaved mother and her child, while evoking themes of family, motherhood, humanity, and slavery. Another of her poems, To the Union Slavers of Cleveland, champions the tragic case of Sarah Lucy Bagby, the last person in the United States to be returned to slavery under the fugitive slave law. In it, Watkins indicts the Union slavers who were complicit in and profited from this practice.
On the Union's bloody altar was your hapless victim laid. Mercy, truth, and justice shuddered, but your hands would give no aid. And ye sent her back to the torture, robbed of freedom and of fright, thrust the wretched, captive stranger back to slavery's gloomy night. But you cannot stay the whirlwind when the storm begins to break, and our God doth rise in judgment for the poor and needy's sake. And you and your sin-cursed guilty union shall be shaken to its base, till ye learn that simple justice is the right of every race.
Powerful, prescient words. Frances Watkins was a brave and generous Black feminist. While traveling and lecturing, thousands of her books were sold, and she donated much of the proceeds to the Underground Railroad. At a time when other literate women were suffering from emotional ailments brought on by the weight of repression and misogyny, Frances decided that her personal survival and well-being were inextricably linked to the survival and well-being of the larger society, and that confrontation and not silence was the way to guard mental, if not physical health. She believed that the progress of American society was threatened by slavery and by religious and social hypocrisy, and she wrote to educate an emerging literate womanhood. Frances Watkins Harper attended the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia as an adult, drawn to its fight for abolition, and would likely be classified today as a Unitarian Christian. In an essay entitled Christianity, she wrote, "Christianity is a system claiming God for its author and the welfare of man for its object." The motivation for her ethics and action came from her religious beliefs. She believed in a loving God, the dignity of human beings, and the teachings of Jesus. She, like other activists before and since, have looked to the Golden Rule and Jesus's stand for justice as their ethical guides. Frances Ellen Watkins was someone whose faith informed her practices, as illustrated by an event in 1858, when Watkins refused to ride in the colored section of a segregated trolley car in Philly, 100 years before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. A year later, Frances wrote to John Brown, the fiery abolitionist leader of the raid on Harper's Ferry after he had been arrested, saying, "I thank you that you have been brave enough to reach out your hands to the crushed and blighted of my race. I hope from your sad fate, great good may arise to the cause of freedom." In fact, Harper was one of the very few public figures who did not abandon John Brown after his failed efforts at Harper's Ferry, instead staying with Brown's wife, Mary, at the home of Lucretia Mott, Philadelphia's leading Quaker abolitionist, for 2 weeks preceding John Brown's hanging. Frances Watkins also took part in and advocated for what was called at the time the Free Produce Movement. The Free Produce Movement was a boycott of products produced by slave labor. She writes of the stance in her poem, Free Labor.
I wear an easy garment, or no toiling slave, wept tears of hopeless anguish in his passage to the grave, and from its ample folds shall rise no cry to God. Upon its warp and woof shall be no stain of tears and blood. Then lightly shall it press my form, unburdened by a sigh. From its seams and folds shall rise no voice to pierce the sky, and wetness at the throne of God, and language deep and strong, that I have never oppression's hand for deeds of guilt and wrong.
By the way, the pictures that you've seen during this talk are pictures we have of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Frances Watkins' marriage to Fenton Harper in 1860 slowed down her lecturing schedule, and the birth of their daughter, Mary, in 1862 temporarily put a hold on her oratory career. With the death of her husband, 1 short year later, Harper began touring again, giving lectures and publishing poetry in various anti-slavery publications. In fact, Frances Watkins Harper became the first Black woman in America to have a short story published in a magazine. Let me take a moment to repeat that. Frances Watkins Harper was the first Black woman in America to have a short story published in a magazine. That story, 2 authors, highlighted the issues for women when it came to the legal statute and economic dependencies imposed to suppress women. Early in her life, much of her writing had focused on abolition, but that was not her only cause. Watkins Harper wrote and spoke tirelessly on gender equality, temperance, and Christian reform. She spoke to both Black and white audiences, calling them to lives of integrity and meaning. Watkins Harper formed alliances with strong figures in the feminist movement, including Susan B. Anthony. In 1866, Harper gave a moving speech entitled "We Are Bound Up Together" before the 11th National Women's Rights Convention. She demanded equal rights for all, including Black women. And she said, in part,
"You white women speak here of rights. I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in the situation of Ishmael, my hand against every man, and every man's hand against me. While there exists this brutal element in society which tramples upon the feeble and treads down the weak, I tell you, if there is any class of people who need to be lifted out of their airy nothings and selfishness, it is the white women of America."
Later, Stephanie will read another excerpt from this speech as the closing words for this service. In doing research for this celebration of Frances E.W. Harper, I came across an enlightening article entitled "The Unfinished Work of the 19th Amendment" by Emma Gray and others that outline the split among women along color lines in the battle for suffrage. The article informs us that many of the first generation of suffragists were also abolitionists and set aside their goal of enfranchisement for women to help in the fight against slavery during the Civil War. Once the North won, many suffragists believed that all people would be given the right to vote, expecting, as noted suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, that when the constitutional door is opened, we will avail ourselves of the strong arm and the blue uniform of the Black soldier to walk in by his side. Instead, suffragists were asked to support the 15th Amendment, which only extended the right to vote to Black men who had died by the thousands in the Civil War. The article continues by describing how Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, along with some other white suffragists, believed that if only one group could get the right to vote first, it should be white, educated women. To see Black men enfranchised over white women infuriated many white suffragists. The causes of abolition and women's suffrage, once compatible, became increasingly at odds with one another. The article concludes that in the late 19th century, as women were bravely fighting for the right to vote, Southern states were busy disenfranchising Black men, using grandfather clauses, literacy tests, polling taxes, and extreme violence. Given these divisions, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA, co-founded by Stanton, Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Lucy Stone, decided it would be politically expedient to simply exclude Black women. Black women who had once been prominent in the suffrage movement were now excluded from leadership, with some Southern NASA chapters refusing Black members altogether. By 1896, Black suffragists, including Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Mary Church Terrell, and Harriet Tubman, formed the National Association of Colored Women, with our own Frances Ellen Watkins Harper as vice president. The NACW's motto was "Lifting as we climb," and they advocated for women's rights as well as to uplift and improve the status of African Americans. Some white suffragists were actively hostile to Black voting rights, while others, while not as overtly racist, were still comfortable with excluding Black women when it was politically expedient to do so. Corinne M. McConaughey, a political scientist and author of The Women's Suffrage Movement in America, A Reassessment, writes, to point to their choices and stress the need to understand them isn't to single out the activists, but to foreground how deeply race structured the political system and how much that mattered to the prospects for a truly broad and integrated women's movement. Like Susan B. Anthony, Frances E.W. Harper, who died at 85 in 1911, was never able to legally cast a vote for president. It was her life's work to fight for equality, even though her labors were for freedoms she herself would never enjoy. When asked about that, she said, "Apparent failure may hold in its rough shell the germs of a success that will blossom in time and bear fruit throughout eternity." Frances Harper was remarkable. She was a Black woman born in a time and place surrounded by slavery where every day something tried to kill, if not her body, then her spirit. And yet, Frances lived, loved, and achieved. Frances Harper was remarkable because she used her voice and her poetry to enlighten and educate a wide audience to the hypocrisies of her time. Frances Harper was remarkable because she worked in collaboration with, and when necessary, confronted other suffragists in the quest for a truly universal suffrage. Frances Harper was remarkable because she put her faith into action to advocate for a more just world. Frances Harper was remarkable for so many reasons, and yet we have one more reason to celebrate her. She was one of us, a Unitarian. And now, on the cusp of an historic election, where the Democratic contender for vice president is a Black Indian American woman, I wonder what our Unitarian foremothers, Susan B. Anthony and Frances E.W. Harper, would say. Would they be amazed? having never dreamed that such a thing was even possible. Or more likely, would they say, well, this is all well and good, but it's about damn time. Now let's roll up our sleeves because there is more work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy and Myra, for your sharing, your teaching today. We come to the time in our service for our offering. While the music plays, you are invited to make a monetary offering. The offering link will be posted, is posted in front of you. It's not an active link though. You can make an offering anytime after the service as well. Let us now sing our closing hymn, One More Step, performed by Jeremy Jacobson.
In May 1866, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a leading poet, lecturer, and civil rights activist, addressed the 11th National Women's Rights Convention in New York, joining Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott, who were among the featured speakers. This is an excerpt of her speech, "We are all bound up together." I feel I am something of a novice upon this platform. Born of a race whose inheritance has been outraged and wrong, most of my life has been spent battling against those wrongs. But I did not feel as keenly as others that I had these rights in common with other women, which are now demanded. About 2 years ago, I stood within the shadows of my home. A great sorrow had fallen upon my life. My husband had died suddenly, leaving me a widow with 4 children, one my own and the others stepchildren. I tried to keep my children together, but my husband died in debt, and before He had been in his grave 3 months. The administrator had swept the very milk crocks and wash tubs from my hands. I was a farmer's wife and made butter for the Columbus market, but what could I do when they had swept it all away? They left me one thing, and that was a looking glass. Had I died instead of my husband, how different would that have been the result? By this time, he would have had another wife, it is likely, and no administrator would have gone into his house, broken up his home, and sold his bed and taken away his means of support. So I took my children in my arms and went out to seek my living. While I was gone, a neighbor to whom I had once lent $5 went before a magistrate and swore that he believed that I was a non-resident and laid an attachment on my very bed. And I went back to Ohio with my orphan children in my arms without a single feather bed in this wide world. That was not the custody of the law. I say then that justice is not fulfilled so long as a woman is unequal before the law. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. You tried that in the case of the Negro. You pressed him down for 2 centuries, and in doing so, you crippled the moral strength and paralyzed the spiritual energies of the white men of the country. When the hands of the Black were fettered, white men were deprived of the liberty of speech and the freedom of press. Society cannot afford to neglect the enlightenment of any class of its members. This grand and glorious revolution which has commenced will fail to reach its climax of success until, throughout the length and breadth of the American Republic, the nation shall be so colorblind as to not know man by the color of his skin or the curl of his hair. It will then have no privileged class trampling upon the unprivileged classes, but will be then one great privileged nation whose privilege will be to produce the loftiest manhood and womanhood that humanity can attain. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. We will now hear the postlude performed by Jeremy Jacobson.
Oh freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom, freedom is coming. Oh freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom, freedom is coming. Oh freedom, freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Oh yes, I know. Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Oh yes, I know. 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 Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Oh yes, I know. Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Oh yes, I know. Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Oh yes, I know. Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Freedom is coming. Oh yes, I know.
Wow, thanks to Dick Hagelberg and Jeremy, that was awesome. Please join me now as together we extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Thank you all for joining us today. There will be an unmoderated coffee hour, community hour chat for those interested beginning in just a few minutes.
Everyone should be able to unmute themselves now.
thank you for that wonderful service, Cindy and Myra and Sada and Ruth and